Hello everybody, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Serita Cucumber, and today I'm going to be discussing and possibly answering one of the most burning questions of one of Life is Strange 2's most cherished endings, and that's the question of whether Sean and Daniel are criminals in Blood Brothers. Some of you will be sitting at your screens pondering why I'm even bothering making this video. Surely they're criminals. They killed about 20 police officers at the border, right? As well as maybe having to kill Elizabeth? In this video, I will attempt to explain and justify as many of Sean and Daniel's actions as I can in terms of the law, the implications for not doing these things, as well as how much of it I think can be explained by necessary evil, as well as offering an insight into their Puerto Lobos life, and whether they appear to be criminals in Mexico, given the gang attacks on their home, the substantial amount of money, etc. Now, I'll preface this by saying, I definitely believe in chaotic neutrality to an extent. I think that Blood Brothers is the ending that aligns the most with my personal sense of morals, as it's just my personal opinion that they should look after themselves first. However, some of you may disagree with some of these statements, so try to remember that above all, I'm putting the safety, happiness, and individual freedom of Sean and Daniel above everybody to analyse Blood Brothers and how their lives actually are after they're forced to take life for their freedom. I will also say that if you believe the question of whether Sean and Daniel are criminals or not ended with them crossing the border, this probably isn't the video for you. I feel like a broken record sometimes saying this, but obviously there will be major plot spoilers ahead for Life is Strange 2, as well as some potential references to the story of the first season, Before the Storm, and Captain Spirit. I would also like to note that before we start this video, I do have a cold if you haven't noticed already, so if my voice sounds a little bit less energetic than usual, that's probably why. Let's begin. So, throughout Sean and Daniel's journey, a clear moral stance can be defined by the brothers, and it all factors into what Sean teaches Daniel. Daniel will follow suit under Sean's action. The best V-Slice example of this is stealing Hank Stamper's camping gear in episode 1. The game immediately reinforces an example of your actions having consequences when Daniel steals the hula girl from Brody. We need to figure out if this makes Sean and Daniel criminals for choosing this line of morality. Now, we should start with the base definition of criminality. What is a criminal? The English Oxford Dictionary defines criminal as an individual who has committed a crime. Well, video over. Remember to keep your cucumbers serrated and have a nice day. I'm kidding. I don't think it's fair to interpret this one definition of criminal, and I'll explain why. It all has to do with the connotations and associations of criminality in a person. If you think of a criminal, what sort of image does this conjure up in your mind? Perhaps you think of gruff men in ski masks robbing a bank. Maybe this makes you think of murderers, or perhaps arsonists, or something like that. You know who you don't think of? People who were convicted of manslaughter after somebody killed their parents and were locked up for retaliating in sheer pain. You don't think of the people who shoplift to take care of their children because they lost their job. You don't tend to think of these people who are anomalies in the legal justice system. They're not usually what people tend to imagine under the guise of criminality. The word criminal has so many negative connotations, and to call Sean and Daniel criminals, in my opinion, would be downplaying the circumstances that meant that they had to do morally questionable things. It isn't like Sean started becoming a Grand Theft Auto 6 protagonist, killing people for fun and robbing banks to pay for his next overpriced yacht. He did things like work on a pot farm to raise money to get to Mexico. He actually originally favoured honest work over everything else, but was ripped off so hard while doing it, as we see from his diary entries. This is why I think it's important to note that while yes, Sean and Daniel are criminals as per the definition of law, they are not of criminal nature. I've seen a lot of people refer to low morality playthroughs as evil gameplays, but in none of the endings is Daniel inherently evil, besides maybe Lone Wolf, which is an exception because they pretend it doesn't exist. The argument that always is raised against this point is that Daniel clearly demonstrates his quote-unquote evil nature in the police station when he frees Sean, but I'd like you to view things from his perspective for a moment and get the exact amount of information that Daniel got about the situation. Obviously, Sean knows that Officer Campbell is completely disgusted by the actions of the racist vigilantes, but Daniel doesn't even know who shot him. All Daniel knows is that he was running away from the border towards the car when he heard a gunshot, felt a sharp pain in his arm, and fell over unconscious. He woke up a day later, probably on some sort of medical bed, in an infirmary he didn't recognise. He was terrified, and his first motive was to break out and find Sean. Look at the information Daniel had. He probably thought the police shot him. He didn't know who did until Sean tells him. Low morality Daniel in episode 5 is also still very chirpy and upbeat in a way with Joanna and demonstrates that he still loves Sean. I think this is where the misconception is. Low morality Daniel puts himself and his brother above all else. He is chaotic neutral, not evil. Whereas high morality Daniel is more in a good sense, willing to adhere to the law in every sense he realistically can, which is evidenced by parting ways. So, as for the journey, let's look at the things Sean and Daniel can do on their journey that constitute criminality. Though I would like to say that it is possible to get Blood Brothers ending without hurting anybody determinant. I'll link to a Twitter thread made by Bay, a friend of mine, in the description, which proves that killing the cougar, Lisbeth, the police in the station, etc. isn't all necessary to get Blood Brothers, it just helps a lot. You will have to steal a few things, namely the camping gear. Now, Sean and Daniel did need that gear to survive after all they'd been through over the last few days, but Hank Stamper was a racist dickhead who kidnapped Sean and assaulted Daniel. This being said, Hank was knocked over and arguably in some form of position of submission and surrender when Sean kicked him in the head. Sean definitely could have left the store without kicking him, and stealing the camping gear plain and simple wasn't necessary. As much of a horrible person as Hank is, Sean only further implicates himself as a criminal by stealing from the Stamper gas station, as while he and Daniel greatly needed the gear to survive, it can be argued that they could manage without, and that stealing was a vengeful act fueled by Sean's anger at his treatment. But here's the thing. Violence does not solve violence. Sean isn't contributing healthily to his own image and trying to deface his own criminality in this case, and while it is fair to say that a person in this situation experiencing the fear he may not know how to act, the intense fear he felt due to Hank and his attacks does not justify Sean assaulting him, as not only does Sean attack a person who is on the ground and poses no threat to him with a clear escape route, but also steals from him. This is relevant to another issue I will discuss in a future video on Merrill and his justification in shooting Finn or Daniel. So, Sean commits an act of criminality under intense duress and fear, an act when, might I remind you, he was at a vulnerable position where he may feel he has no other choice. The next act of criminality is the destruction of the motel room, which is among a list of offences the Diaz brothers can be blamed for in the police interrogation scene in episode 5. Now, does this constitute a nature of criminality? No, it does not, nor was it an intentional crime committed. It would be the exact same as cutting your leg, getting blood on the bedsheet and being blamed for it as if you'd intentionally done it. Daniel could not control his outbursts at all. There is no way there should have been ever a point raised against them with the lack of evidence. Next, Sean's foray into squatting in an abandoned house, which may fall under squatters' rights. Sean living in this home would be liable to an eviction notice if found in the home while living there, as well as maybe having to pay for the minor property damage caused by Daniel breaking a window accidentally, which Sean mentions and is evidenced in episode 3 by a boarded up window. But other than that, the Diaz brothers are safe to squat at this home, which I doubt anybody would seriously care about. Sean is not a criminal for using an abandoned home as a base, it's actually rather resourceful of him. The next crime Sean can really commit is working on the pot farm in Humboldt, California. It is important to note that, as mentioned earlier, Sean favoured legal work as evidenced by his diary long before he came to work at the pot farm. Not only this, but this was never really raised as a point against him in episode 4 during the interview in the hospital with Agent Flores. So not only does it lack a criminal nature, but also a nature of criminality, it seems, if that makes sense. As Cassidy put it, the police seemed more than happy to bust the weed operation going on than a bunch of hippies who worked there. Cassidy, Penny and Hannah were all let go without charges or further investigation after giving their statements. The heist and Sean's agreement in it, however, is a different matter entirely. Regardless of stealing from Merrill, who is the owner of a pot farm, they are still stealing. Merrill is a business owner, and as much as he is a jerk, Sean is not within right at all to consent to robbing him. In order to get the Blood Brothers ending, one of the main sticking points is that Sean should agree to the heist, in order to lower Daniel's sense of morality. This is one of the scenarios where, while I can understand Sean's train of thought, I would not refute the argument that this is direct criminality. Of course, however, the circumstances are important. The provocation of Sean's brother nearly being beaten before his eyes by Joe, the desperation to get to Mexico to escape corrupt law enforcement, etc. Merrill really did not deserve to be robbed, but he'd had enough of a child working on his weed farm, and Sean and Daniel stuck out like a sore thumb, causing far too many problems to be kept around. If Sean disagrees to the heist, he is exonerated, or at least should be, and he can lie to Flores about it, which is also a crime, but I digress. This is a criminal act, and while justified in the sense of self-interest and preservation, in the eyes of the law, likely the general public, the headline Diaz brothers attempt robbery on a safe in a pot farm with deadly force is likely not going to be viewed very well, and so it should be taken into consideration that this is an accepted viewpoint to say that they were in the wrong for choosing to steal. Episode 4 leads me to a justifiable and following a totally unjustifiable series of acts. Breaking out of police custody and then Grand Theft Auto. After Sean's realisation that Daniel is in Haven Point, his immediate motive to want to escape is well justified, given Flores and a mantra of Sean potentially spending the rest of his life in prison. His escape from the hospital room, if done peacefully, marks a morally justifiable goal. He does not want to evade the law to go out and steal, or to live his life of crime. He wants to find his missing brother, who is a 10-year-old, taken to Nevada with somebody who is partially a stranger. This is justified as a goal. However, the way he accomplishes this in stealing and hotwiring a car from the hospital parking lot is totally unjustified. He steals a car from what seems like an innocent, undeserving person in order to fulfill his goals, which is a selfish way to propel himself towards getting to Nevada. I understand his needs, but the ends do not justify the means in these circumstances. Sean's robbery of the car is criminal, regardless of your choices, and this is still a criminal nature. This leaves a bad impression on Sean specifically. Daniel, however, is not bestowed with this blame leading up to Blood Brothers. Next, and presumably the most obvious of them all, is killing Lisbeth. Now, I'd like to preface this saying that I'm not a legal expert. I'm a law student, yes, but I don't know American law very well. However, despite the fact that Lisbeth does not need to be killed if Sean and Daniel have a high bond and trust, killing Lisbeth from Sean's perspective can be perceived as an act of justifiable self-defense. She had trapped him inside a burning building, blocking the exit and refusing to move. Since self-defense relates to the danger the defendant believes they are in, regardless of the actual danger, it is easily plausible that Sean would be fearful for his life, for example, the roof collapsing, burning to death, or suffocating. Not only this, but Sean also aimed a gun at Lisbeth and gave her a fair warning and chance to move out of the way before he shot. He was justified in his movement of shooting her, even if there was a potentially better way he could have done it. Daniel killing her would also fall under the same defence, if not the defence of loss of control. He had good reason for doing what he did, and to be fair, Lisbeth had it coming. So I've already mentioned the police station. So now, what about the altercation at the border? What can be justified about this, and how does it reflect on their fugitivity? Well, it's important that we observe both sides of the situation, so we'll start with arguably the easier side to talk about, the police. The police officers at the border, excluding Flores, are likely unfamiliar with the case of Sean and Daniel. They've probably heard of it, yes, through news, bulletins, office chatter, because this is an extremely high-profile case, but remember that they don't know the brothers the way we do. What they know about them is that they've caused 3 separate explosions, killed a police officer, robbed a gas station and attacked a cashier, attempted robbery on a weed farm, burned down a church, and potentially killed down a reverend in said church. This is Arizona. There are more likely to be more religious folks due to how close it is to the Bible Belt of the USA. They're likely going to view this as abhorrent and disgusting in nature, and there's a high moment of tension at the border. The police have their guns drawn in masses at the 2 fugitives who pull up in a car after using deadly force to escape a police station, which now lays internally in ruin. Then the younger of the 2 boys gets out of the car. Picture this. You're a police officer, standing near the roadblock with Agent Flores. You see the officers before you closing in on Daniel. You're thinking that it's going to be a case of one of the brothers obeying and the other refusing. Then suddenly, the officers start flying away from him through the sky. It's like an act of God. Look how confused every other Life is Strange character has been over Daniel's power. Claire was repelled, shocked, scared. Cassidy, Finn and Jacob were dumbfounded. Karen still couldn't believe it after nearly 2 months of being around Daniel and watching him practice his gift openly. So think of how these police officers felt when they saw it for the first time. Officers flying, you suddenly hear a lone cry of shoot, and so you do. You try not to aim at the child, you don't want to be the one with that on your conscience. But as you fire more and more, your eyes catch a glint of the force field and you begin shooting to kill. This is something you've never seen before, it's like witchcraft. And then you see him take out the officers in front of you, and you're flung backwards by some kind of invisible force. You break your neck against the border wall behind you, dead. So that's the police perspective. Let's consider it from Daniel's perspective. You're scared getting out of the car to face these police with guns aimed at you. You've been shot twice already and you don't want to make it a third. You start throwing around the officers with your power, but as expected, they open fire on you and you're forced to block bullets. Deep down, you don't want to kill them, but they keep firing, despite your hope that they may stop. You realise that these officers seem vengeful, like they really want you and Sean dead. You're remembering exactly what happened to your dad. Being torn away from your grandparents, being forced to work at the weed farm, your entire life being uprooted, the indoctrination because of Lisbeth, having to flee from your mother's home, being shot, and it all manifests itself in this strong and willful anger. It spawns this sense of determination. You have to get through this border, and there's only one way to do it. So you start killing. You use the power with zero suppression or consideration for how strong you're hitting. You kill them all at the border as if in a blind flash of rage. They shot at you first, and you needed to do it. The other options of dying or being separated were simply not options in your head. See, there are two sides to the story. On one hand, the situation never should have existed in the first place. However, on the flip side, these officers only knew what they'd heard on the news and through bulletins and briefings. Yet again, shooting at a child is inexcusable. But in equal respect, they were likely terrified of Daniel in his power. However, I think Daniel can be absolved of some of the blame of criminality due to the intense nature of the situation. The police would have also been shooting a 10-year-old to death, so is Daniel using his power to kill adults in retaliation to this gross act really inexcusable? I think that, especially given Daniel's regret expressed in his line, "We can go now," we can see that he wasn't killing out of any pleasure, out of any unnecessary means. It was the only way for him and Sean to escape the injustice. Now, does this justify Daniel killing 20, 30 people? No, it's not a whole justification at all. These people likely did not deserve to die. However, I think there's an element of understanding among fans for Daniel's actions, and this understanding is that he did what he thought he had to do, the same as Sean. This is likely the most controversial element of the criminality that Sean and Daniel commit. This is the epitome of their low morality journey. Their self-preservationist attitude here is clearly reflected in this ending by their lives together after the events at the border. Yet, unlike killing Lisbeth, this would not be entirely an act of self-defense on Daniel's part. There is to be brought into question an element of criminal nature. Daniel's actions definitely constitute committing a crime. However, I wouldn't say he murdered the police at the border. I'd say that it was definitely more likely to be manslaughter-based charges. Yet, unlike with killing Lisbeth, I don't think there's a way he can be totally absolved of the blame. This is a complicated moral issue that I'll address again when I come to my conclusion later in the video, yet I'll leave it at saying that there was definitely an element of Daniel doing what he thought he had to do. And as well as that, the excessive force used might not have been entirely necessary. We see in parting ways that Daniel is perfectly capable of getting both brothers through the border without harming anybody. So, as for the ending itself, what are their lives in Mexico really like? Are they really part of a criminal nature, as some speculate, or are they still employing the tactic of do whatever it takes? I'll be going over some popular theories and rating them on their credibility and how much I agree with them, so here we go. The first theory is that Sean and Daniel are currently part of a gang, which is evidenced by the newspaper clipping of a gang hideout being raided and the fact that they receive attacks on their home from a rival gang, as well as a substantial sum of money in their safe. However, I do not believe this is the case. Sean and Daniel, throughout the entirety of their journey, have never favoured acts of extreme greed or criminality. They never wanted that in their life at all. The brothers, even in some of their lowest moral moments, such as stealing from Hank, killing Lisbeth, stealing from Meryl, they have never done any of these acts out of any sort of agenda. Not once, despite the racial attacks on Sean, has he ever aggravated an attack against a white person solely for these reasons. He has never acted out of agenda or malice. All of these attacks were motivated by one common factor, that Sean needed to, or at least thought he needed to do these things. Sean being part of a gang contradicts his character's motives so far. The motive has always been to survive, ensure Daniel is safe, and get to Mexico. Now, Sean is not a greedy person. He makes mistakes, but greed is definitely not a sin of his. Therefore, affiliation with gangs would mean that Sean is looking beyond himself and acting as part of a group pushing some sort of rivalry and agenda within the Mexican streets. Does this sound to you like the Sean Diaz who stole from a gas station so he and his little brother could survive in the cold, so Daniel would have enough to eat? It makes no sense that he should start acting like this for that money, which is exactly why I'm inclined to say that Sean and Daniel are not part of a gang. It doesn't fit with their characters and it doesn't make sense. The next theory is that Sean and Daniel are actually vigilantes who defend the streets of Mexico. This one makes more sense to me due to the Wolves poster and the fact that they're being attacked by gangs. However, Blood Brothers being an ending where the brothers are vigilantes, while a valid interpretation of the ending, is not something I can really resonate with due to the chaotic neutrality of the ending at face value. Sean and Daniel, while still trying their best to be decent people, don't seem to have communal interests or anything. They appear mostly alone in Blood Brothers, and while obviously Don't Nod's goal is to leave endings up to interpretation, I think that if this was the intended image for the ending, it would have been implied further by some background items. The money is not from donations, it seems, and the Diaz brothers still appear to be relatively individualistic in the ending. If they were vigilantes, I'd say the ending would more represent chaotic good, which it doesn't really. While I can definitely see how some people would come to this conclusion, it doesn't resonate with me personally, but you can always let me know what you think about it down in the comments. The third interpretation, which is the one that I'm most inclined to believe, is that Sean and Daniel were the ones who cleared out the gang hideout in the newspaper clipping in order to earn the money to start up their business in Puerto Lobos. They likely approached the town with little to no money and either found a gang using Esteban's garage as a hideout, or something else. It is clear that the gangs know that they have a lot of money and that is why they keep trying to rob Sean and Daniel, yet they would know this perhaps only if the Diaz brothers originally stole the money from their gang. They clearly run a legitimate business at the Diaz repair shop, but in a small coastal town like Puerto Lobos, there is absolutely no way they're doing anything but scraping by on the amount of money that would earn them. I think it's safe to assume that the money they got is not entirely legitimate, but likely ill-gotten gains. I don't believe that Sean and Daniel are part of any gang, only that they cleared out a gang hideout and stole the money for this. Now, it is important to note that by killing gangsters, nothing of value is really lost in Mexico. They're actually making the town safer for citizens, however it still isn't right to kill them. But I think that rather than viewing Sean and Daniel as hardened criminals, I believe they're still simply preserving their own interests, and rather than defending themselves within the boundaries of the law, such as calling the police, they're taking matters into their own hands and defending their own land. I don't think they're wanted criminals in Puerto Lobos, yet it was their only way to survive and to start up this business. Regardless of how stupid having a safe downstairs is, they're doing what they can in order to defend themselves. Not killing. The worst Daniel seems to do is break the gun-wielding gang member's arm when he threatens Sean, but merely injuring and threatening. They seem surprised to a degree about the power, so I find myself questioning whether this is actually true that they've attacked before, or whether this was a one-off attempt at armed robbery on the Diaz brothers but with no prior history. So, the final question. Do I believe that Sean and Daniel are criminals in the Blood Brothers ending? Yes. By the raw definition of criminality, they were criminals the moment they ran from the crime scene in Seattle. I do believe they've done some shady things to survive in Mexico, but are they of criminal nature? No. They did what they had to survive. But does this absolve them entirely of blame? No, it doesn't. It's a complicated matter, but I will start this by saying that Sean and Daniel are not evil in this ending. There is no evil nature to their actions. They're self-preservationists. Even the game phrases it this way. Overall, you taught Daniel to put himself and his brother first. He's not evil or of criminal nature. To apply to the question, he's just putting him and his brother higher than adherence to the law. I'd also like to remind you that each of these endings requires a sacrifice. The sacrifice of redemption is that Sean loses 15 years of his life, and afterwards, he and Daniel get to live relatively normal lives in the USA, with Lila and Karen a part of their lives. The sacrifice of parting ways is that both of the brothers get exactly what is best for them, except that they are split apart possibly forever after everything they've been through. The sacrifice of Lone Wolf is Sean's life for Daniel to get to Mexico. Lone Wolf Daniel is definitely regarded as having criminal nature and should be referred to as criminal, since he is pickpocketing, robbing banks, and seems to be involved in some level of organised crime for more than staying alive. And finally, the sacrifice of blood brothers is their old lives and their childish innocence. The sacrifice is the weight on Daniel's conscience from killing all of the police at the border. Their lives in Blood Brothers are so different. The true sacrifice of this ending is them being unrecognisable from how we first met the brothers in episode 1. Esteban would be so disappointed in them for what they've done to survive. I think in this regard we should forgive Blood Brothers, Sean and Daniel, for their actions. They've only done what they had to do to survive. It's up to interpretation, of course, whether the Wolf brothers had to do any of this to survive, but given that it's the only ending where they'll end up together, I think it's hard to look at Sean and Daniel in this ending, as unrecognisable and hardened as they may be, as anything other than victims in a system that screwed them over, uprooted their lives, and the result of this can be seen in the people they've been forced to become in order to take their freedom. This is a vicious cycle of racism. A pair of entirely innocent individuals are involved in a shooting where their father is murdered, leading to the pair of them having to do questionable things to survive, leading to yet more people like Chad and Madison using their examples of crime to wage their bigoted war against them. In Blood Brothers, however, they're free, in Mexico, and while the sky isn't always clear, the Diaz brothers are safer than in America. They're free, and so I rest my case in answering that while Sean and Daniel may be criminals, they are not of criminal nature, and this is the sacrifice that must be made for their safety, happiness, and freedom. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to let me know what you think, as I'm sure there'll be many differing opinions on this in the comments. Please give this video a like if you enjoyed, and share it with a friend who enjoys Life is Strange also. Follow me on Twitter, which is in the description, and join the Wolfston Discord server, where myself and a bunch of other lovely people engage in discussion about Life is Strange 2. The link will also be in the description. And as always, remember to keep your cucumbers rated, and have a nice day. Buenos dias! The money is not from donations, it seems, and the Diaz brothers still appear to be relatively individualistic in the ending.